If you were to drive down Torresdale Avenue in the Holmesburg section of Philadelphia, specifically to the address 8215, you'd come across this massive stone structure.
You really can't miss it.
No, it just looks impenetrable, heavy, very old. And it was. It was built in 1896, and it operated as a correctional facility all the way until 1995.
That's a century. It's a place that really looms large in the local history of Philadelphia, and certainly in the history of the American penal system as a whole.
Yeah. The architecture alone, it just sends a message, doesn't it?
Yeah.
A message of, I don't know, permanence and severity.
Exactly. Locally, it was known simply as Holmesburg Prison. But inside those walls, and eventually in the press, it earned a much, much darker nickname.
The Terror Dome.
The Terror Dome. And while the facility was decommissioned in the mid-90s, the structure itself, it's still standing.
It is. I understand it's occasionally used for prisoner overflow or some work programs, and there's a training academy nearby.
Right. But for the most part, it's a monument. It's a monument to a very specific, and I think we can say, a very troubled century of operation.
And when we look at that century, we're not just looking at the history of a jail.
No, not at all. We're looking at this really unique intersection of criminal justice, medical science, and ethics. The history of Holmesburg is it's inextricably linked to the history of medical experimentation in the United States.
It's almost like a physical record of how our standards for human rights have, shifted over the decades.
Or how they were ignored. It serves as a stark reminder of that.
That's exactly the purpose of our exploration today. We're going to examine the history of this institution, but our primary focus, our lens, is going to be on the decades-long, controversial medical research that was conducted behind those walls.
It's a long and complicated story.
It is. We're going to track the timeline right from the prison's construction through the arrival of the doctors, all the way to the formal apology that was issued by the city of Philadelphia in 2022.
And it is a complex story because it involves a core tension, a tension that really defines so much of the 20th century.
Which is?
On one side, you have this massive push for scientific advancement, the development of new pharmaceuticals, dermatological treatments, even biochemical weapons for national defense.
And on the other side?
On the other side, you have the question of ethical treatment of incarcerated individuals. Holmesburg is the place where those two powerful forces collided head on.
So to guide us through this, we're relying on a whole set of source material. We're looking at historical records, investigations that were conducted by the Philadelphia Police Commissioner and the district attorney.
And very detailed accounts of the dermatological and pharmaceutical trials themselves. These sources really allow us to reconstruct not just what happened, but I think more importantly, how it was allowed to happen for so long.
Right. It requires us to try and understand the mindset of everyone involved, the administrators, the researchers.
And of course, the inmates themselves. Their perspective is crucial.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Part one of this story takes us back to the late 19th century. Why was Holmesburg even built in the first place?
Well, it was a matter of necessity, or at least what was seen as logistical necessity at the time.
Meaning?
In the late 1800s, Philadelphia was relying very heavily on Moyamensing Prison. That facility had been operating since 1835.
So it was old even then.
Very old. And by 1896, Moyamensing was severely overcrowded. I mean, dangerously so.
Yeah.
The city just needed a relief valve, a place to put people.
So they built Holmesburg in northeastern Philadelphia.
That's right. It was the modern solution to an old problem.
And there was a specific philosophy behind the design, wasn't there? It wasn't just about warehousing people.
Oh, there absolutely was. The original penal philosophy was something called separate penal confinement.
That sounds familiar.
It should. It was derived from the Pennsylvania system, which was famously used at Eastern State Penitentiary, another Philadelphia landmark.
Okay, so what did that entail? Separate confinement.
The architecture and the protocol were designed to utilize isolation tactics. The idea, the theory, was that separation would lead to penitence, which is where we get the word penitentiary.
Solitude would make you reflect on your crimes.
That was the belief. If you kept a prisoner in solitude, with only a Bible and their work, they would reflect, they would repent, and they would reform. The building was designed to enforce that isolation.
But that philosophy, that design, it failed almost immediately.
It really did. And the failure was driven by, well, demographics and urban growth. Philadelphia was expanding rapidly.
So same problem they were trying to solve just reappeared.
Instantly. Just like the prison it was meant to relieve, Holmesburg quickly filled up. The whole isolation model, it relies on having enough space to keep people apart. That's the core requirement.
But once you have overcrowding, that model just collapses.
It completely falls apart. As early as 1928, so just a few decades after it opened, there were major riots in the facility.
Those were directly linked to the conditions.
Directly. Driven in large part by the conditions in the overall cells. When you take a cell that was designed for one person in solitary reflection and you put 2, 3, sometimes more men in it, the psychological pressure becomes immense.
So even before a single medical experiment began, Holmesburg already had a reputation. It was a difficult, dangerous environment.
A very dangerous environment. And that reputation was cemented, truly burned into the public consciousness in 1938 with an incident that became known as the Klondike incident.
The Klondike incident. Tell us about that.
This is a really critical moment in prison's early history. It illustrates the level of absolute control the guards had and the severity of punishment that was possible there away from public view.
What sparked it?
It started with a hunger strike in August of 1938. There were 23 prisoners involved, and they were protesting equality of the food.
Which, as you said, is a pretty constant source of tension in penal history.
It is. It's a common complaint. But the response from the administration was anything but standard. It was extreme.
What did they do?
As punishment, these 23 men were placed in an isolation cell block, a specific punitive wing of the prison known as the Klondike.
The Klondike. Why that name?
The name was a kind of cruel irony. The structural design of this block was such that the steam heat could be controlled externally by the guards, while the ventilation was minimal to non-existent.
So they could turn up the heat from the outside.
They could, and they did, and the outcome was fatal.
How hot did it get in there?
Well, we have to remember this was August in Philadelphia, so it was already hot and humid outside. Inside, the steam heat in that isolation block was cranked up to its maximum setting. The radiators just ran uncontrollably.
And inside the cells?
Forensic analysis later on suggested the temperatures inside the cells reached nearly 200 degrees Fahrenheit.
200 degrees?
It was effectively an oven. The men were trapped inside, banging on the doors, screaming for help, but the heat was just relentless.
And people died?
Yes. 4 of the prisoners died from the heat. It was a horrific way to go.
Did the prison manage to cover this up?
No, the fallout was significant. It wasn't swept under the rug this time. There were major investigations into what the press started calling the bake oven deaths.
And those investigations led to real consequences.
They did. It led to the indictment of 10 prison officials. And this wasn't just low-level guards. This included the superintendent and the deputy warden.
So this event, it really established a baseline for what Holmesburg was, a place where extreme extrajudicial punishment could happen.
Absolutely. It sent a message both to the inmates and to the public about the power dynamics inside those walls.
Before we move into the era of medical trials, there is one other famous event from these early years we should probably mention.
Right. The escape of Willie Sutton.
In 1947, he's a legendary figure in American criminal history.
He really is Slick Willie, a prolific bank robber. At the time, he was serving a life sentence at Holmesburg. And in 1947, he engineered this incredibly audacious escape that just completely embarrassed the administration.
How did he do it?
He and several other prisoners, including a man named Frederick Tenuto, they dressed up as prison guards.
It sounds almost too simple, like something out of a movie.
It relied on pure confidence and planning. They had somehow manufactured or acquired uniforms, and they carried ladders across the prison yard in broad daylight.
And nobody stopped them?
Nobody. The guards up in the towers, they just assumed it was a maintenance crew or maybe fellow officers going to do some work on the wall.
So they just walked up to the wall with ladders?
They did. Use the ladders to climb right over. It was a massive, humiliating breach of security for what was supposed to be this escape-proof facility.
And Sutton was caught eventually, but not everyone was.
That's right. As a fascinating side note to the story, Frederick Tenuto was never recaptured. He's one of the very few who successfully vanished from the Terror Dome for good.
So if we take stock, by 1950, Holmesburg is known for riots, for these bake oven deaths, and for high-profile escapes. It's a chaotic, overcrowded, and dangerous facility.
That's the perfect summary of its first 50 years.
And it is into this exact environment that a man named Dr. Albert Kligman steps in. Which brings us to part 2 of our story, the architect of experimentation.
Dr. Albert Kligman is the central figure in this entire narrative. To really understand what happened at Holmesburg for the next quarter century, you have to understand Kligman.
Tell us about him. What was his background?
He was born in Philadelphia in 1916 to Jewish immigrant parents. By all accounts, he was an incredibly bright, ambitious student. He actually obtained his PhD first in botany from the University of Pennsylvania in 1942.
Botany, that seems like a strange precursor to human experimentation.
It is, but it's also significant because it framed his scientific worldview. He studied plants, fungi, molds. He had a very systematic, almost agricultural way of looking at biological systems.
So after his PhD in botany,
He went back to school to get his medical degree, which he finished in 1947, also at Penn. So you have this unique combination. He's a botanist turned dermatologist.
and his specialty was related to his botany work.
Very much so. He specialized in fungal infections, mushrooms, molds, things that grow on skin. He became a professor of dermatology at the University of Pennsylvania, a very prestigious position.
So what was the catalyst? What brought a Penn professor to Holmesburg Prison?
Something very mundane, actually. A simple outbreak of athlete's foot.
That's it.
That's it. In the 1950s, the inmate population at Holmesburg was suffering from a massive, widespread fungal infection of the feet. You can imagine, given the sanitary conditions and the overcrowding, it was just rampant.
And someone at the prison knew of Kligman's work.
Exactly. The prison pharmacist had read one of Kligman's academic papers on the topic and reached out to him directly for help for advice on how to treat it.
And Kligman accepted the invitation to visit the prison.
He did. But when he arrived, he didn't just see patients who needed treatment. He saw something else entirely. He saw a scientific opportunity.
And this is where that infamous quote comes from.
This is it. There's a quote from Kligman that is cited in almost every single account of this period because it's so revealing. He described his first impression of seeing the inmates lined up. He said, "All I saw before me were acres of skin."
Acres of skin.
It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time.
That phrase it's chilling. It's so incredibly revealing.
It captures the dehumanization inherent in everything that was about to come. It suggests a resource to be harvested, not a patient population to be treated.
So for a researcher like Kligman, the prison environment was, in a way, perfect. Seductive even.
It was the perfect laboratory. It offered controlled conditions that you simply cannot find in the general public.
Can you elaborate on that? Why was the prison environment considered so superior for research at the time?
It all comes down to controlling variables. Think about it. When you conduct clinical trials in the outside world, you have to account for the fact that all your subjects live different lives.
They eat different things, sleep at different times.
Exactly. They have different sleep schedules, they travel, they might drink alcohol, they might forget to take the medication or not take it at the exact same time every day. There are a million variables you can't control.
But in Holmesburg,
In Holmesburg, the diet was standardized, the lifestyle was standardized, the daily routine was identical for everyone. The variables were minimized almost to zero.
and the subjects weren't going anywhere.
That was the key. Kligman viewed the inmates as an idle collection of humanity that was ideal for long-term study because they were a captive audience, literally.
So he established his operations there very quickly.
He did. He started visiting regularly, setting up a lab, and it's important to note that initially he was operating without any formal authorization.
No contract with the city or the university.
Not at first. He reflected on this years later, saying, quote, "Informed consent was unheard of. No one asked me what I was doing. It was a wonderful time."
Wonderful time.
That's how he saw it. Eventually, he did get permission from the superintendent, but for a long time, there were no formal contracts between the city and the University of Pennsylvania. It was a handshake agreement to use the facility and its population.
And the scale of this operation, it grew to be massive. This wasn't just Kligman doing a small side project.
Oh, no. It became a major research hub right inside the prison. Kligman was incredibly successful at securing financial backing from 33 different sponsors.
And we're not talking about small companies.
We are talking about the biggest entities in American industry, pharmaceutical giants like Johnson & Johnson, chemical companies like Dow Chemical,
And even the government.
and the U.S. Army. They all funded research at Holmesburg.
What about the participation rate among the prisoners? How many of them were involved?
The numbers are staggering. In a total population of about 1,200 inmates, it is estimated that somewhere between 80 and 90% were experimented on at some point during their incarceration.
80 to 90%. That is almost everyone.
An incredible number.
Which leads us directly to the most critical question. Why? Why would 90% of a prison population agree to become test subjects? And this brings us to part 3. The economics of consent.
This is really the crux of the entire ethical debate. The inmates were not, for the most part, physically forced into the chairs. They weren't dragged, kicking and screaming to the lab.
They volunteered.
They volunteered, exactly. But we have to look very, very closely at the context of that choice. What does voluntary mean in this environment?
And a big part of that context was financial.
It was almost entirely financial. You have to understand the bail system in Philadelphia at the time. You could secure your freedom while you were awaiting trial, but you had to pay 10% of the set bail amount.
And many of the men in Holmesburg were there simply because they couldn't afford that 10%.
That's the key. Many were pretrial detainees. Technically innocent until proven guilty, but they were incarcerated purely due to poverty. They couldn't scrape together $50 or $100.
So participation in the experiments became a way to literally buy their freedom.
Precisely. It was the only way. We have the account of a former inmate named Leotis Jones, and he stated it very clearly. He had a low bail, but he couldn't afford it. He believed the charges against him were false, and he desperately needed money for a lawyer.
The experiments were his only option.
His thought process was entirely pragmatic. If he could earn enough money inside the prison to hire legal counsel, he could beat the charges and go home. The experiments were the only way to generate that kind of capital.
Let's talk about the pay. How did it compare to other work available in the prison?
There was absolutely no comparison. Standard prison labor, working in the laundry or the kitchen, paid pennies a day. Literally.
And the experiments?
The experiments paid significantly more. Rates would range from maybe $10 to $50 per test, which was a huge amount of money for them. Some of the more long-term or high-risk studies could pay up to $800.
$800. That could cover bail and a lawyer for many of them.
Absolutely. It was life-changing money in that context. We have testimony from another inmate, Al Zabala, who talked about this.
What did he say?
He noted that the tests he did were for things like foot powder, eye drops, deodorants, toothpaste. He described it as easy money compared to the back-breaking, low-paying prison labor.
And he got more involved over time.
He did. He eventually started working as a lab technician for Kligman inside the prison, earning $40 to $50 a month. That was a salaried position, a fortune compared to the standard prison wage.
So this financial pressure, this incentive structure, it created a deeply coercive environment.
That's the word for it, coercive. When the only alternative is grinding poverty and continued incarceration, and this job pays exponentially more than anything else available, the concept of free and voluntary consent becomes incredibly compromised.
And beyond the economic coercion, there was the issue of informed consent.
Which was virtually non-existent.
Even though the Nuremberg Code had been established by then.
The Nuremberg Code existed on paper, yes, after World War II. But in practice, at Holmesburg, the inmates often had no idea what they were being given. They were told it was a test for a new soap, they were told to pay, and that was it.
The risks were not explained.
The risks were rarely, if ever, fully explained. They signed a waiver, but they weren't given the information to make a truly informed decision.
So let's get into the specifics of those tests. Part 4, the experiments, dermatology, and biology. It all started with Kligman's specialty, right? Skin.
That's right. The early tests were relatively routine from a dermatology perspective, though still very unpleasant for the subjects. They were testing treatments for ringworm, for example.
How would that work?
Well, to test a cure, you first need the disease. So the protocol involved administering enormous quantities of fungi to the inmate's skin. Then they'd have them wear heavy boots for a week to induce a severe infection so they could then test the efficacy of various creams and powders.
They also worked with viruses.
Yes, herpes simplex, the wart virus. Again, infecting subjects in a controlled way to study the progression of the virus and test potential treatments.
And then there were the commercial trials.
Right. Those were the bread and butter, testing products for companies, soaps, toothpastes, deodorants, as Zabala mentioned, even things like liquid diets.
But the research didn't stay there. It quickly moved from routine to radical.
It did. We have records of much more invasive procedures. For instance, the removal of sweat glands.
Why were they doing that?
Kligman wanted to study the physiology of sweating. So the procedure involved having inmates physically exert themselves, run on a treadmill, do jumping jacks to activate their sweat glands, and then they were immediately taken to be operated on to have the active glands harvested for examination.
There were also reports about using cadaver fragments.
Yes. This was research into skin regeneration. Small fragments of skin from cadavers were literally stitched into the backs of living inmates.
And the goal was what? To see if it would grow.
The goal was to test regeneration capabilities, to see if the dead tissue fragments could be stimulated to grow back into functional living tissue on a host.
The physical toll on these men must have been significant. We have the account of Edward Anthony, who participated in a Johnson & Johnson test.
His story is particularly harrowing. The test involved a new bubble bath product, and the specific protocol was to test if the product was harmful to open wounds.
So the subject had to have open wounds to begin with.
Correct. Patches of skin were abraded or cut to create the wounds, and then the product was applied. Anthony reported developing huge blisters, followed by fine red bumps that filled with pus. He described the sensation as feeling like his back was on fire.
And what happened when he tried to stop?
Even after he quit the test, he said the pain persisted for a long time. The damage was already done.
And these weren't just short-term effects, this pain and blistering.
No, many former subjects have reported long-term, debilitating issues, chronic skin problems, strange rashes, cancers, and a whole host of undetermined illnesses that plague them for years, for decades after their release.
The research also moved beyond just the skin. There were biological agents involved.
Yes, Kligman and the other researchers expanded their work to test exposure to all sorts of biological irritants and viruses.
Such as?
Poison ivy, poison oak. They would apply concentrated extracts to the skin to induce severe reactions, again, to test calming lotions and treatments.
They also introduced the Hong Kong flu.
They did. They introduced the flu virus into the general prison population to study its transmission and to test potential vaccines.
But in a crowded prison, a virus like the flu, it's impossible to contain that to just the test subjects.
Of course. The impact extended far beyond the individuals who signed the consent forms. It affected the health of entire cell blocks. One man's job became another man's illness.
This is all disturbing enough, but the scope of the research then expanded into something even more ominous. This takes us to Part 5, chemical warfare and the Cold War context.
Right. We have to place this in the broader timeline of American history. This is the height of the Cold War, the late 50s, the 60s.
And the U.S. government, particularly the Army, was deeply concerned about chemical warfare.
Deeply. And also about mind control techniques. There was a pervasive fear that the Soviets were ahead of the U.S. in these areas. There was a psychochemical gap.
So the U.S. Army became one of the main sponsors at Holmesburg.
A major one. The Army's Chemical Warfare Service, or CAWS, had been officially approved for human subject research in 1959. They saw Holmesburg and its population as the perfect testing ground.
And they set up their own operation there.
They did. They set up trailers on the prison grounds, separate from Kligman's dermatological labs, to conduct their own series of tests on mind-altering and incapacitating agents.
And the setup inside these testing areas was modified specifically for these experiments.
It was. Records show they installed pliable furniture and padding in the cells that were used for these experiments.
Padded cells. That detail alone suggests they were anticipating violent or completely uncontrolled reactions from the subjects.
Precisely. If you need to pad the room for the experiment, you know the drug you're testing is likely going to cause a severe, unpredictable reaction.
How many different compounds were tested?
The records indicate over 254 distinct chemical compounds were tested on the inmates for the Army.
And what kinds of chemicals were they?
They fell into several classes. There were incapacitating agents designed to disable an enemy without killing them. There were glycolates and anticholinergics. And there were indoles, which is a chemical class that includes LSD-25.
Let's talk about some of the specific agents that are mentioned in the records.
Sure. There was a compound they called Agent 282, which was reported to cause extreme grogginess and disorientation. There was Agent 834, which resulted in severe mental impairment and vivid hallucinations.
And Agent 111.
That was atropine sulfate. And its effects were described as causing a dulling of consciousness, a state where the subject couldn't distinguish reality from fantasy.
There's one other compound mentioned that sounds particularly dangerous, EA3167.
Yes, this one has a very troubling backstory. It had previously been accidentally injected into a researcher's thumb at an Army lab, and it caused that researcher permanent brain and nerve damage.
So they knew it was incredibly toxic.
They knew it was neurotoxic. And despite knowing this, or perhaps because they wanted to understand that toxicity better, they decided to test it on the Holmesburg inmates.
And they didn't just test it, they escalated the dosages.
Aggressively. Sometimes increasing the amount given to the next subject by 40% at a time, trying to find the absolute limit of what a person could take.
What were the inmates' experiences like with these chemical agents?
The reports are terrifying. They describe things like temporary paralysis, being unable to move for hours. Some subjects experienced a sudden onset of extremely violent behavior.
And hallucinations were common.
Very common. Half of the subjects in certain trials reported having hallucinations that lasted not for hours, but for days on end.
It must have reached a point where, even within the prison, rumors started to circulate about these specific tests.
They did. The inmates were not oblivious. They knew that the Army tests were different, that they were dangerous in a way that the skin cream tests were not.
And that affected recruitment for those trials.
Yes. Rumors that the Army was using LSD and other mind drugs caused some prisoners to actively avoid those specific trials, even with the promise of very high pay. They were quite simply afraid of losing their minds permanently.
So we've covered experiments on the skin and experiments on the mind. But there were other categories of testing as well. This brings us to part 6, radioactive and dioxin testing.
This really reflects the other great anxiety of the Cold War era, which was, of course, radiation.
And Kligman got involved in this as well.
He did. He applied for and received a license from the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission to use radioactive isotopes in his research at the prison.
What was the stated objective of these radioactive tests?
The official goal was to study the turnover rate of human skin, how quickly skin cells die and are replaced. To do this, they used a substance called radioactive thymidine.
Did Kligman and the regulators at the time believe this was dangerous?
Kligman defended it vigorously. He claimed the radioactive materials were, quote, excised within minutes of being applied and were never left in the body long enough to cause harm.
But his license was eventually revoked.
It was. The use of radioactive thymidine in these experiments was disapproved in 1965. But for a period of time, radioactive material was being routinely applied to human subjects inside Holmesburg Prison.
And then there's the dioxin testing. This involves major corporation Dow Chemical.
This is one of the most controversial and well-documented chapters of the whole affair. Dioxin, or TCDD, is a highly toxic compound.
It's a component in Agent Orange.
Exactly, the infamous defoliant used in the Vietnam War. By the mid-1960s, there were already scientific links being made between TCDD and fetal cancers, among other serious health problems. The EPA was moving to ban it from use in pesticides.
So why was it being tested on prisoners at Holmesburg?
Dow Chemical partnered with Kligman to try and prove its safety. They were facing regulatory action and potential bans, so they wanted data to show that there was a safety threshold, an amount a human could theoretically tolerate without adverse effects.
And how did they attempt to find that threshold?
By injecting the substance into people in increasingly large amounts until they saw a reaction. The methodology was incredibly aggressive.
They just kept increasing the dose.
They kept escalating the dosages far beyond what was even in their own initial protocol. In some cases, the doses reached 468 times the amount listed in the original plan. Some men were administered as much as 7,500 micrograms.
And what were the results of these massive doses?
Chloracne. It's a severe and very specific skin condition characterized by inflammatory pustules and painful papules. It's a clear physical manifestation of dioxin toxicity. And these outbreaks could last for months, even years.
There's a quote from Kligman that surfaced much later in a 1981 press expose that speaks to his attitude about all this.
It's a statement that really reveals his apparent callousness toward risk. When a reporter asked him about the potential risk of leukemia for the test subjects who had been exposed to all these chemicals, he said, "I could be hit by an asteroid when I walk out on the street, but I don't think I will."
It's a complete dismissal of the long-term consequences for the people he was paid to experiment on.
A total dismissal.
Eventually, all of this, the riots, the public mood, the sheer extremity of the experiments, it started to create pressure on Holmesburg. This brings us to part 7, legal battles, riots, and closure.
The real turning point began around 1970. On July 4th of that year, a massive riot broke out at the prison. It was incredibly violent. Over 100 people were injured.
What was the official cause?
As you can imagine, interpretations differed sharply. The police commissioner at the time, Frank Rizzo, he blamed politicized racial conflict among the inmates.
But reformers and inmate advocates saw it differently.
They did. They pointed to the deep structural issues that had been festering for decades: severe overcrowding, a complete lack of any meaningful activities or programs, and widespread systemic abuse by guards.
And the racial demographics of the prison were a significant factor here.
A very significant factor.
Right.
By 1968, the prison population was 85% black. The lower-ranking guards were also largely black. But the entire supervisory structure, the lieutenants, the captains, the wardens, they were all white.
So you had this incredibly tense, stratified environment just waiting to explode.
Exactly, and it did.
And while these riots were happening, the medical experiments were also finally coming under serious external scrutiny.
Yes. There had been that brief ban back in 1965 by the FDA, mostly over record-keeping discrepancies, but Kligman had been reinstated very quickly.
But the public mood was changing in the early 70s.
It was changing dramatically. The key event was the public revelation about the Tuskegee syphilis study, the horrific experiment where black men in Alabama were deliberately left untreated for syphilis for decades, just so doctors could study the disease's progression.
Didn't that shock the nation?
It shocked the conscience of the nation, and people began to look at places like Holmesburg with fresh, horrified eyes.
There was a congressional hearing on human experimentation in 1973.
That hearing changed the entire political and ethical climate. The pressure became immense, and in 1974, the prison's board of trustees finally stepped in and forcibly ended all medical experiments at Holmesburg.
But the legal battles continued for years after that. In 1976, there was the case of Roach v. Kligman.
Yes, Jerome Roach was an inmate who sued. He had taken a temperature pill for a study, and he was told it had no side effects.
But it did.
Within days, he developed sore joints, a high fever, nausea, and severe rashes. He claimed he received completely inadequate care, basically, that the prison doctor just prescribed him penicillin without even knowing that Roach was part of an experiment.
And what was the outcome of that lawsuit?
The court dismissed his claims. At that time, in the mid-70s, the legal protections for prisoners were incredibly weak, and the liability waivers they had been required to sign were treated as legally binding, regardless of how informed their consent actually was.
But policy did start to change at a federal level.
Yes. In 1976, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare issued brand new regulations. They severely restricted inmate experimentation, permitting it only for low-risk research that could be of direct benefit to the prison population.
So the era of using prisoners as subjects for chemical warfare and industrial toxins was effectively over.
It was over. The regulations made it impossible to continue that kind of work.
Holmesburg Prison itself, though, it remained open for almost another 2 decades, finally closing its doors for good in 1995.
And since its closure, it's had this strange second life. It became a film set.
What's been filmed there?
Movies like Condition Red, Up Close and Personal, Animal Factory with Willem Dafoe, and more recently, the thriller Law-Abiding Citizen.
It's deeply ironic, isn't it? That the site of so much real-world horror became a manufactured backdrop for fictional horror.
It is a very strange legacy. And today, access is strictly controlled. No public visitors, no historians, no film crews. It just sits there silent.
So let's talk about the lasting legacy of this place. This is part 8, because Holmesburg represents such a significant and dark case study in the history of bioethics.
The central ethical issue here is the flagrant violation of the Nuremberg Code. This code was established in 1947 in the aftermath of the Nazi medical experiments. It's the foundational document of modern medical ethics.
And it has very clear requirements.
It's very clear. It explicitly requires voluntary consent. It states that the subject must have the legal capacity to give consent and must be able to exercise free power of choice without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, or coercion.
And based on everything we've discussed, the bail money, the extreme poverty, the lack of full information, Holmesburg failed that standard on every single count.
Completely and utterly. The coercion was economic, not physical, but it was coercion nonetheless. And the lack of knowledge regarding the true dangers of the chemicals being used violated the requirement for sufficient knowledge and comprehension.
Alan M. Hornblow, who wrote extensively on this subject, he made a powerful comparison to Tuskegee.
He did. He noted that what happened at Holmesburg was in many ways as gruesome as Tuskegee, but the shocking part was that it happened in a major American city, not in the rural South.
It was happening in plain sight, in a way.
It was. Hornblum's point was that prison walls don't just keep inmates in, they keep public eyes out. And that is what allowed this to happen in the open for 25 years in one of America's largest and most historic cities.
There were attempts at some form of justice much later on.
There were. In the year 2000, a class action lawsuit was filed by 298 former prisoners against Dr. Kligman, the University of Pennsylvania, and Johnson & Johnson. They were seeking medical care for their chronic conditions and financial compensation.
But that suit never went to trial.
No. In 2002, a federal court dismissed the suit. And it's important to note, it wasn't because the court found the events didn't happen. It was dismissed on a legal technicality.
The statute of limitations.
Exactly. The court ruled that too much time had passed, that the men had waited too long to sue.
So legally, they received nothing. However, the moral weight of what happened was finally acknowledged.
It took a very, very long time, but yes. In 2022, the city of Philadelphia issued a formal public apology to the victims of the Holmesburg experiments and to their families.
And what did that apology say?
It was an official acknowledgement that the city had failed in its duty to protect the people in its custody, that it had allowed their bodies to be used and abused for the sake of science and profit.
As we wrap this up, it is just worth reflecting on the sheer scale of what we've been talking about. This went on for decades.
A quarter of a century.
Hundreds of chemical compounds tested, thousands of men used as subjects.
And it leaves us with this very uncomfortable reality that some of the medical progress made in the mid-20th century, some of the creams we use, some of the drugs that were developed, was achieved at the direct expense of the most vulnerable populations in our society.
We can't separate the science from the sorrow that produced it.
We can't. And that's the enduring, difficult legacy of the Terror Dome.
We do want to acknowledge the source material for this analysis, which includes historical records, police reports, and extensive public archives on the matter.
It is a difficult history to confront, but one that is absolutely essential to remember.
Thanks for listening.